We are getting ready to start Revelation, the 8th chapter. Last week we dealt with chapter 7 through verse 14. And then for the devotional, I spoke about those last several verses, 15 through 17, how they are a further description and condition of the people who have been sealed by God and are now being sheltered by His presence. Are there any questions or comments on chapter 7 or anything else related before we go into chapter 8? With the beginning of chapter 8, we see the opening of the seventh seal. So this is the seventh and final seal that's going to be opened by the Lamb. And you will note that as we've come throughout the opening of these seals, each seal got a little more involved in its description and a little more lengthy. Now, as we open the seventh seal, we see that with the opening of the seventh seal, we are going to have the introduction of 7 trumpets. And these 7 trumpets are all part of the seventh seal. And the 7 trumpets are going to be blown, and that's going to signify a set of circumstances and events that are going to take place. And then, when we get to the 7th trumpet, just like when we got to the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet is going to bring about 7 chalices or 7 vials. We would call them cups, right? And these are cups of suffering that are going to be poured out on those oppressors of God's people. So I say that to say that the 7th seal is going to take several chapters here. I believe through the 11th chapter is all going to be involved with this 7th and final seal. Now, when we opened the first seal, what happened? That was chapter 6.
Noise of thunder.
Noise of thunder?
4 beasts are saying, "Come and see."
Absolutely. And then what are we seeing? The white horse. So all these are in there. I'm glad, Mike, I was kind of looking for the white horse, but I'm glad that you mentioned all that commotion, right? Because there's thundering and there's noise, and the beast, the creature, the living, is saying, "Come here," and then there's a war horse that comes out. And so is the case with the second seal. And so is the case with the third seal and with the fourth seal. Then when we get to the 5th seal, rather than a horse, we have the martyrs coming out from and under the throne of God. The 6th seal, when we see it open, there is a great earthquake. And the sun and moon are blackened in these tremendous events. And of course, that 6th seal brings us right on through to the end of the 7th chapter. I say all these things because we are going to see a significant contrast between the rest of these seals and the 6th seal, at least in its beginning. Because if you would read with me in verse 1, and when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was, what's that word?
Silence.
Silence. That's quite the difference, isn't there? Now, this silence doesn't last forever. But what we have here is all this commotion, and amongst all the commotion of the seals, prior to that, we have the praising of God and the singing, and we have harps, and thundering and all kinds of noise. And now the Lamb opens this final seal and silence falls over all of heaven. I think we're building anticipation as we open this seventh and final seal. It also signifies a few other things that we'll get into as we go a little bit further. Verses 1 through 5. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the seven angels who stood before God, and the seven trumpets who were given, and seven trumpets were given them. Verse 3. Then another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So the silence is suddenly broken open in a big way, isn't it? But notice the silence seems to last until verse 5. Now, it would seem as though that this silence and the burning of the incense is reminiscent of the Day of Atonement. Now, I went back into Leviticus and spent some time studying there because there were a lot of things about the altar and the burning incense that I did not understand very well. And as I understand it at this point, what would take place is there was an everlasting fire on the altar of God. We would take fire out of that altar, the priest would, and put it in a censer to burn incense. And then would go into the holies, into the sanctuary, and would fill that with incense. That incense then would roll over top of the veil. What did the veil separate, by the way?
The covenant.
The inner and outer?
And the Ark of the Covenant and it.
The Ark of the Covenant was in there. Mike, were you about to say something as well? The Holy of Holies was in where the Ark is. The inner part that Kevin described it, right? The presence of God was at the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. So the incense would roll over that veil and then it before the altar, right? So we're burning the incense in the holy, not the Holy of Holies, except for the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, I believe this is Leviticus 16, 13, and 14, we see that the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies with the censer. And he would burn so much incense in there that it would veil the presence of God. It would veil the altar, not the altar, excuse me, the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. And then he would go and he would put blood at the corners. Okay, and that was the Day of Atonement. Now in Luke 1, verse 10, there before the birth of Christ we see, I want to say Ezekiel, but it's not Ezekiel. I'm going to have to turn there because my mind's playing tricks on me. It's the name we're all familiar with. Zacharias, right? Now then, still turn there since. And the whole people, this is Luke 1 and 10, the whole multitude of the people were praying outside the hour of incense. This is while Zechariah is in burning the incense. This is what he would have been doing. The reason that I mention that is because Zechariah, of course, we know, has a vision about the coming Messiah or the Christ. And by the time we get to verse 21 of Luke, the first chapter, we see the people are wondering why he's in there so long and where he's at. So it's believed that this half hour of silence would equate to about how long it would take the high priest to go in and burn the incense and then come back out. Does that make sense? Now, because of this being the duty of the high priest, we see there are 7 angels before the throne of God that are each given a trumpet, and then there is another angel that's given the incense or has the incense. Many suggest that this is Jesus Christ himself. The reason for that is that this angel is doing the work of the high priest. And Jesus is our high priest. I see that as a real possibility. However, who this angel is not important here. What he does is important. He's burning his incense before God. Now, what does the incense represent?
The prayers of all the saints.
The prayers of all the saints. And that's not just here in Revelation. If you'd go back, and I mentioned some of these verses. If you don't have them in your Bible, I encourage you to make little notations for your own study. Psalm 141, verses 1 and 2. There David describes the incense as the prayers of God's people. So he burns the incense. I think the image that we get here is that all of the petitions, all of the requests, the crying out of the martyrs from under the throne. Remember, we just ended with chapter 7 with all of those who are coming out of the tribulation standing before the throne, right? And now we have the prayers of the saints who are still on earth coming to God. What are they all saying? It's not stated directly about the prayers of the saints, but I think it's shown in what happens. Is this a peaceful time? A wonderful time? These aren't Thanksgiving, although I'm sure these people were thankful. This is distress, right? And I believe this comes right on the back of God having sealed his people, demonstrating that despite what's going on, despite this time of terrible tribulation and duress, God is in control. He's not only in control of all the earth, but he's certainly in control of his spiritual realm. Right? And we're going to see action taking place right here in the beginning of chapter 8 as this 7th seal is open. Questions or comments on that?
What did you say that was Psalms what?
141.
141.
Yeah, verse 1 and 2. Revelation 5 and 8. Want to go there? So now as we get to verse 5, we have all these saints, we have all these prayers of the saints, we have the martyrs and the sealed before the throne of God. The angel takes the censer and fills it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. I've suggested that GES is the Greek word that's used for earth. I believe the idea is the land here. And it's that way consistently before and after this point in Scripture. So he throws it onto the earth. Now, before saying this, I never understood the significance of the fire of the altar. In Leviticus, the 10th chapter, Nadab and Abihu run into trouble. What kind of trouble do they run into?
Used the wrong kind of fire.
They used an unauthorized or strange fire for God. We'll talk about what that meant just briefly in a moment. What happens to them when they do? What
Burn up.
got burned up? Here's what I always missed. What burnt them up? I don't think you'll be able to answer that without turning there, so you may want to turn to Leviticus, the 10th chapter. I think it's around verse 10. No, it's early. Leviticus chapter 10.
Beginning of the chapter.
What burns them up, Kevin?
With fire from the Lord.
Fire from the Lord.
Verse 2.
Now, if we were to flip ahead to Numbers, you can write this down. We won't go there for this reason, for time reasons. But Numbers, the 16th chapter, we have the rebellion of Korah. And there we have fire from the Lord burn up the rebellion. Right? Same place. Now, I've always known from the time I was very young that Nadab and Abihu were burned up. But I think this is interesting because we start to understand, or I've started to understand, what burnt them up.
Yeah, but
That's what I thought, Bob. But if we were to go back a couple chapters, we would see at Mount Sinai that Aaron offers a sacrifice on the altar, and the fire comes from God and lights the fire on the altar. And from that point forward, it was never to go out. And so when they burnt incense, they would go to the altar, because that's not just fire, that's a fire from the Lord or from God. And they would get that fire to burn their incense with. Now does it make sense what Nadab and Abihu did? They got fire from a different source. The fact that the fire on the altar came from the Lord, I believe it was the fire out of the altar that burnt Nadab and Abihu up. And likely the same thing that burnt Korah and his rebellion up in Numbers, the 16th chapter. There's a little bit there for you to dig into if you care to in your own time. The reason I think that's relevant to what we're looking at here is in both of those cases, the fire of the Lord was a blessing for his people. But in those couple cases, Leviticus 10 and Numbers 16, the blessing of the fire of the altar became a curse for those people, because they were in situations that made them contrary to the will of God. You with me on that? Notice where this angel takes the fire from. The altar. Now he fills his censer with hot coals or fire from that altar and throws it onto the earth. And with that, there are peals of thunders, rumblings, flashes of light, and earthquake. I think from our mind and what we're familiar with, we'd say it's like a tremendous bomb, whether you want to call it a nuclear bomb or some kind of enormous bomb from heaven. Does that make sense? So, it is God's fire that should have been his blessing that became their curse when this takes place. Now, I believe the 7 trumpets are describing this in detail. Okay, verses 6 and 7. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now, before we get into the specifics of the trumpet, I think that it's important to have an understanding what the trumpets represent, generally speaking. Can anyone think of trumpets being involved with a city falling? Jericho. I believe that's the imagery that we're getting here. The trumpets are blowing because an unrighteous city is about to fall. Jericho was the first city that was the pathway into the promised land. Jerusalem, in its apostate state, had to fall for God's people to thrive. And there's a parallel there. To take this a step further, though, because a lot of the prophetic books are about Egypt, Babylon, or Sodom being burned up, right? If you would turn over to chapter 11 and verse 8. Verse 8 says, "And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt." Now, this great city that we're seeing these events take place in is called Sodom and Egypt. You know what city? Well, I've told you it's Jerusalem, right? That's clear in the next statement, isn't it? Where their Lord was crucified. Where was Jesus crucified? Jerusalem. So it's clear it's Jerusalem, but symbolically, we are calling it Egypt and Sodom. Now, we are going to, throughout these trumps, see a lot of imagery to both the fall of Egypt. What great events took place before the fall of Egypt? 10 what? Plagues. Calling the events, I thought I may have given you a curveball there. And so we're going to see similarities to the 10 plagues and to the fall of Sodom. So with that then, we get into the specifics of the first trumpet. There followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. Hail and fire mixed with blood. We see two, don't we, of the plagues. Hail and blood. Now, when we mix hail and fire together, can you think of anything at this time in this age that would resemble fire and hail put together?
So what happened to Sodom?
Sodom? Absolutely. I think there's imagery there to that, isn't there? Yep. And we're going to see, especially when we get in chapter 9, specific parallels to Sodom drawn. How did the cities fall? What was used?
Or catapults
Yep.
through fire?
Yep. I think they would catapult burning asphalt essentially into the city. I think literally that we are getting at the idea of war here, right? And the imagery literally is referring to the idea of catapults. But what we see is through this, how much of the earth?
Third part.
A third part. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass. How did the Jewish people historically make their livelihood? Farming. Right? Notice it's a third of the earth, a third of the trees, but what percentage of the grass?
All of it.
All of it. Ooh, this war is going to wipe them out. Now, we talk so much about, or I talk so much about the fall of Jerusalem as we study through this, right? What I haven't mentioned much before this is that Vespasian and Titus don't just march to Jerusalem, besiege it, and conquer Jerusalem. What they do is they start in Galilee. In fact, Josephus is in Jopata. And by the way, I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but BBC has a series on Vespasian. And it covers Jopata, the fall of Jopata, and his campaign down into Jerusalem. So I haven't got to watch it yet, but if you have TV on demand, you may want to check that out yourself. I hope to get to that and check that out. But what he does is, what they do, the Romans do, is they come from the north, they conquer and destroy every walled city, and they take what we would call the scorched earth approach. They're burning these people out, right? They're destroying the land. And that is, I believe, a big part of what we're getting at. Questions or comments?
You think, has this already happened, what you're saying?
I believe the view I'm taking of Revelation as I see it is up until the last few verses or few chapters is talking about the fall of Jerusalem.
You know, it talks about the whole earth being burned up, you know, all the green grass, a third part of the earth. I don't think that happened.
No, and I mention this, I've tried to mention this every week. The word translated earth there is G-E-S, guess. And throughout most of Scripture, it's translated land. And I believe that's really its intended use here, is that a third of the land. And like to illustrate that, if we went back into Galatians, I can't remember the verses, but you'll recall that Paul says that the gospel was preached over the entire earth, or over all the earth. The same word is used there. And he hadn't been, at that time, hadn't been to North America or other unknown parts of the world. So you don't have to necessarily agree, but that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, you're saying that even if you say land, it just doesn't go with what it's saying. I don't believe it. Just
That's
my
fair
opinion.
enough. Yeah, absolutely.
It's just too explicit. A third part was burned up before.
Mm-hmm.
What would it mean, a third part of the land? That doesn't mean anything.
Well-
When you talk about the earth, the third part of the earth destroyed by fire. And that's what that angel threw upon the earth, was fire.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I know this is really hard.
Yep.
I'm trying to look at it in your way, but I'm not.
Yeah, and you certainly don't have to
I'm not
agree.
seeing it like that. I don't think
That's
this happened yet. Because if you read on, it talks about the sea, what all died there, and it turns to blood. That didn't happen.
I would say it did. We're getting ahead of ourselves. But again, you can take
Third
different
part
views.
of the creatures of the sea, it says. You know, I'm getting ahead, I know.
Mhm.
A third part of the creatures of the sea, it's the sea, the oceans.
Well, you're calling it the oceans, but they think of from the author's mind, John's mind.
Yeah.
North America was the ocean was really a foreign concept there. Yeah.
I didn't even know it was there.
Yeah. So I'm not telling you you're wrong, but I'm justified, because I would
He's
say,
looking at
John.
a vision, though. He's looking at a vision,
Right.
and he sees the whole earth. He
Well-
doesn't care what that, new world is called. He just knows that's the earth.
Yep. Well, the two things to think about would be this. If you, chapter 1 and verse 3, it says that those who read or hear the prophecy will understand it because they're going to be blessed. And these things are things in verse 1 that will soon come to place. And in verse 3, the time is near or at hand. It's other way it is translated. We see those same words used at the end. And one of the reasons I keep going to the Old Testament is we see the sun being darkened. Joel, the 2nd chapter. So if you say that the earth or the sun has not been darkened yet, if you go to Joel, the 2nd chapter, and start in verse 28, because when we read these things, they seem so extreme. I think it's the word that you're getting at, right, Mike?
What's that?
That some of these things seem so extreme they couldn't have possibly have happened yet. Am I understanding you right?
Well, this part I don't think has, but I'm not saying the sun hasn't been darkened, because it was when Christ was crucified, it was darkened.
Well, and the moon turned to blood. So,
Which could be an eclipse,
being turned to blood.
gives it that red tint.
So you're using the same kind of imagery, being turned to blood, that doesn't necessarily mean it's physical, a third of all the world being destroyed. But
No, I don't see it as I see it, and it is destroyed.
Well, verse 7 there says, the way it starts, there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. It doesn't say how much of the earth. It just says they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees was burned up. So this might have been just a portion of the earth where it was all cast down.
yeah, so what I would answer, Mike, and again, you'll have to agree, the third is referring to when we get to the 7th trump. When we get to the 7th trump, we're going to see devastating. We're going to see a final judgment on on Jerusalem that completely wipes them out. That's my view. Again, there's difficulty with symbolic language, so don't mean to be dogmatic about it in any way.
No, it's right. I mean, it is difficult.
David,
Could it represent something that's already happened too?
well,
Like
that's
say the fall of Rome, like with the second trumpet maybe. Would that describe Rome maybe falling?
well, I believe these are all Rome coming. So let's go to the 2nd trump, and because this 2nd trump's pretty outlandish, right?
Would that be like the fall of Rome maybe? Would it be a symbol?
Again, that happens well after 70 A.D. There are views that incorporate Rome, even the papacy, throughout time. So let's, the second angel, verse 8, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now here we see something pretty extreme, right? What would we call a mountain burning with fire? Volcano. Now you take a volcano and you throw it into the sea, that's pretty extreme, isn't
We
it?
get Hawaii.
Well, it erupts and pours.
Okay.
There's the fire part.
Yeah, there's the fire. But notice in 8 that we don't have a mountain being thrown into the sea, do we? Look closely. What is it? Something like a great mountain. There's significant difference there, isn't it? Burned with fire. Was thrown into the sea. throughout, Mike, if you would you, or unless you were clearing your throat, do you have another thought? I was going to have you read something.
Yeah, I'll read what you want.
Jeremiah 51, 24, and 25. And I'm going to turn, for time's sake, to Matthew 21, 18. You let me know when you're there, Mike.
Michael, the
Jeremiah
king,
51 what?
24 and 25. Yes, Emily.
the King James says, as it were a great mountain burning.
Okay, the meaning there is still the same, as it were, or as though, like. Yeah. You ready, Mike?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I will render unto Babylon and to all the inhabitants of Chaldea all their evil that they have done in Zion in your sight, saith the Lord. Behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain, saith the Lord, which destroyeth all the earth. And I will stretch out mine hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rock, and I will make thee a burnt mountain.
Okay, what is called a mountain in that passage, Mike read? Babylon, right? He's talking about Babylon, you great destroying mountain. And by the way, Mike, Babylon destroyed the whole earth. That's the same word used there. It's Hebrew in that, but it's a parallel. It's the destroying of the land. The idea, though, of going there is that it is mountains throughout, and there's about 18 other passages. I use that number, just say there's a lot of other passages that refer to nations as mountains. So, David, I think what we do see is the mountain represents, in my estimation, as I see it, a nation falling. I believe it's the Jewish nation falling. And we'll get to the third part of the sea. So, questions or comments?
It is all a bunch of symbols, though. It tells you that in the first part of the book.
Absolutely.
You know, they're relating it to stuff, so
Yep.
it's going to represent something else than what it's truly saying it is.
Yep. Amanda?
Was Jerusalem largely a mountain? It was high mountain.
Well, it's in the mountain, but I think we're getting very literal there because it's not picked up, thrown into the sea. The nation is as a nation. So you can go to your concordance and look up mountains, and you'll see that God refers to them as nations as mountains over and over. Thank you for your time.